Snow had just started falling when Aaron Calloway buckled his daughter into the back seat. It was the soft kind of snow, the kind that makes the whole world look like it has been covered in something gentle and forgiving. Aaron stood beside the truck for a moment before getting in, his breath rising in small clouds in the cold mountain air, and he looked up at the sky the way soldiers sometimes do when they have learned not to take quiet moments for granted. He was 34 years old. He had served 2 deployments. He had walked through places where the ground itself could kill you, where every step required a particular kind of faith that most people never have to develop. He had come home both times, and every time he came home, the first thing he did, before he changed out of his uniform, before he even set down his bag, was find his daughter. Just to see her face, just to make sure she was real. Laura was 6 years old, and she was the single greatest thing Aaron Calloway had ever done with his life. She had her mother's eyes and his stubborn chin, and a laugh that came from somewhere so deep and so genuine that it made every person in the room feel like they had just been handed something precious. He called her his best mission. He meant it every single time. Shadow was already in the back seat beside her. He was a United States Army military working dog, a German shepherd of extraordinary discipline and training, a dog who had served alongside Aaron through conditions that tested every living thing involved. He had done everything ever asked of him without complaint and without fear. But here, in this truck, beside this child, Shadow was something else entirely. He was hers. It had happened gradually, the way the most real things always do. The first time Laura pressed her face into Shadow's fur, she had been 3 years old and barely tall enough to reach him. Shadow had gone completely still, the way highly trained animals sometimes do when they recognize that something requires a different kind of care. And from that day forward, something had been decided between them that no human being had arranged or planned. Aaron had a habit, in the evenings, of kneeling beside Shadow before they went anywhere together, just the 2 of them. He would put his hand on the side of Shadow's face, and Shadow would hold still and look at him with those steady amber eyes. And Aaron would say something low and quiet, the kind of thing you say to someone you trust with everything. That evening, before he got into the truck, he did it one more time. He knelt beside Shadow in the cold driveway, the snow falling softly around them both, and he pressed his forehead briefly against the dog's broad head. And he said, quietly, so quietly that only Shadow could hear, "You take care of my girls, you hear me? Both of them." Shadow looked at him with those amber eyes and held perfectly still. Aaron stood up, exhaled, and got in the truck. Inside, Laura had her small hands buried in Shadow's fur and was telling him something very seriously about a dream she'd had the night before. His name was Captain, she told the dog gravely, and he was a purple horse, and he could fly. Shadow turned his head and looked at her. "See," Aaron said, glancing in the rearview mirror with a smile. "He believes you." Marie laughed softly from the passenger seat and put her hand over Aaron's on the center console. He turned his palm up and held it. The truck moved out onto the mountain road, and the snow came down around them, soft and slow, and everything Aaron Calloway loved most in the world was exactly where he could reach it. That was the last perfect moment. The headlights came around the blind curve without warning, too fast, too wide, crossing the center line on a patch of black ice that had no mercy in it at all. Aaron's hands moved on the wheel with the trained certainty of a soldier who had responded to emergencies in far worse conditions. But black ice on a mountain curve does not care about training or instinct or how much you love the people beside you. The sound was nothing like the movies. It was immediate and total, and then replaced by a silence so complete it felt like the mountain itself had stopped breathing. Shadow was found still beside Laura when the emergency crews arrived. Injured, bleeding from a wound along his left shoulder, but pressed against her, refusing to leave even as his own body shook with cold and pain. It took 3 responders to separate them. Aaron Calloway and Marie Calloway did not survive. Laura survived, and so did Shadow. But in the days that followed, in the hospital bed that was too large for her small body, surrounded by soft voices and careful footsteps and the heavy silence of people who do not know what to say, Laura did not speak, not once, not a single word. She lay with her eyes open, staring at the ceiling, present in her body, but gone from the world in every way that mattered. Doctors spoke about trauma-induced mutism, about acute stress responses, about the mind protecting itself from pain too large to hold. They used calm clinical language, and they meant well, every one of them, but none of their words came close to what was actually happening inside her. What was actually happening was this. Every morning, when Laura opened her eyes, there was a single half-second before memory returned. A half-second of just being awake. And then it came back, all of it, at once. Her father's voice, the particular weight of his hand on top of her head, the sound of his laugh filling a room so completely that there was no space left for anything sad. And then the silence where all of that used to be. She reached for her father's hand in her sleep. Every night, for months, she reached for it, and every night she found only the cool edge of a sheet or the corner of an unfamiliar pillow, and she would curl her fingers around nothing and lie still and wait for morning. Shadow was transferred through military channels during those months. His injury healed, but the paperwork governing his future moved slowly through a system not designed to track the emotional geography of a 6-year-old girl and the dog who had refused to leave her side in the wreckage. No one connected them deliberately. No one separated them deliberately either. It simply happened, the way so many painful things happen, through the ordinary motion of a world that does not always stop to notice what it is pulling apart. Laura did not know where Shadow had gone. She only knew that her father was gone, and her mother was gone, and Shadow was gone. And the place inside her, where all 3 of them had lived, was now so quiet that sometimes she pressed her hand flat against her own chest, just to feel that something was still moving there. Sheriff Daniel Hayes came into Laura's life 8 months after the accident. He was a large, unhurried man, with hands that had steadied a great many frightened people, and eyes that had seen enough of the world's hardness to make the softness in them feel genuinely earned. He had worked alongside military canine units early in his career and understood, with a specificity that went beyond sympathy, what those animals meant to the families built around them. When he heard about Laura, something in him shifted and did not shift back. He drove home that evening and sat across from his wife, Carol, at the kitchen table and told her the whole story. Carol listened to everything, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said simply, "Well, when can we meet her?"
Their home was warm, with a porch swing and a kitchen that smelled like coffee in the mornings. Daniel had painted Laura's room soft yellow because someone mentioned it was her favorite color. Laura walked through the front door, looked at everything carefully, set her small bag beside the yellow bed, and nodded once. That was all. Daniel and Carol learned her language the way you learn the language of something you love. A nod for yes, a turn of the head for no, a drawing left on the kitchen table when something needed to be said that she had no words for. They never pushed, they simply stayed, steady and warm and present, without demanding anything in return. She drew every evening at the kitchen table with a focused intensity that Daniel found both beautiful and heartbreaking. Animals mostly, landscapes sometimes, and in nearly every single drawing, standing clearly in the foreground or worked quietly into the background, a large German shepherd with kind eyes and a scar along his left shoulder. Daniel kept every drawing. It felt like something that should not be lost. Laura was 9 years old on the morning her class visited Riverside Animal Shelter. Daniel had volunteered to help supervise, present without hovering, close without crowding. The shelter was loud, the way places full of animals and hard surfaces are always loud. Most of the children bunched together, overwhelmed and giggling, covering their ears. Laura walked beside her class for a few minutes, and then, gradually, almost without anyone noticing, she drifted, past the first row of kennels, past the second, deeper into the building, pulled by something that had no name, something that felt less like curiosity and more like recognition. Daniel followed at a distance, saying nothing. She stopped near the very back of the shelter, in front of a kennel set slightly apart from the others. Inside sat an older German shepherd. He was not barking, he was not pacing. He sat near the back of the kennel with the stillness of an animal who had learned to be patient with the world, watching the hallway with calm and steady eyes. His muzzle was silvered with age. There was a scar along his left shoulder, pale against the darker fur, the shape of something that had healed into permanence a long time ago. The name on the kennel plate read, Shadow. Laura went absolutely still. The dog rose slowly, carefully, and walked to the front of the kennel. He did not bark. He did not jump. He simply stood there on the other side of the chain link and looked at her. His tail moved once. Slowly. Gently. Exactly the way it used to move when a 6-year-old girl buried her hands in his fur in the back seat of a black truck on a snowy mountain road. Laura took one step forward. Her hand came up. It was shaking so badly that she pressed it briefly against her own chest first, the way she had learned to do in the years of silence, pressing against herself just to feel that something was still there. And then she extended it, slowly, through the bars of the kennel door. Shadow lowered his great gray head and pressed it into her palm. He exhaled, long and slow and complete, the way a living thing exhales when it has finally, after a very long time, arrived somewhere safe. Laura's knees bent. She sank down to the floor of the shelter hallway, her hand still pressed against Shadow's head, her forehead coming forward to rest against the kennel bars. Her shoulders rose once, sharply, and then began to shake with something that had been locked inside her for 3 years. Something that had no name, but had weight, enormous weight. The weight of every night she had reached for her father's hand and found nothing. She was crying. For the first time since the accident, she was truly crying. Not the empty, staring grief of the hospital. Real tears from somewhere so deep the whole body was involved, the kind that means something has finally, mercifully, cracked open. Daniel Hayes had his back against the wall of the shelter hallway, with both hands covering his face. Laura pulled back slightly from the kennel bars and looked at Shadow's face, his amber eyes, the gray at his muzzle, the scar she had drawn 100 times on paper at a yellow kitchen table without ever knowing if she would see it again in the real world.
She leaned forward one more time, and in a voice barely more than a breath, fragile and rough and trembling with 3 years of silence behind it, a voice that cracked on the very first syllable and held together through something deeper than will, she whispered, "Shadow, you found me." Daniel Hayes dropped to one knee on the concrete floor. He had been a sheriff for 30 years. He had held himself steady through things that would have broken most people, but he had never, in all of that time, heard anything like that voice. That small, cracked, returning voice saying a dog's name like it was the most important word in the English language. He had never heard her speak before.
In 3 years, across thousands of mornings and careful evenings and patient, loving days, he had never once heard her voice. And the first word she spoke in his presence was a name. Shadow pressed closer against the bars, his tail moving steadily, his eyes never leaving her face, with the complete and absolute attention of an animal who has one person in the world and has just found them again after far too long. Shadow came home with them that same afternoon. That first night, he slept on the floor beside Laura's bed, his breathing slow and even in the darkness, a warm and solid presence in a room that had been silent for too long. Carol stood in the doorway for a long time, watching them both, her hand pressed flat against her own chest. Laura began speaking to Shadow first, soft sentences in the darkness when she thought everyone was asleep. Daniel and Carol could hear her from the hallway, and they stood there together and held each other's hands without a word, because some things are too sacred for commentary. She told Shadow about her father's laugh, about the way Aaron said her name, the particular music of it, like he was savoring every part. She told him about her mother's warm hands and the way they cupped her face when something important needed to be said. She told him about Captain the Purple Horse who could fly. She told him about the last perfect moment in the truck, her father's palm turned upward on the console, her mother's quiet laugh, the snow coming down soft around all of them. She told Shadow everything that had been living in the silence. And he listened the way he always had, as though every word she spoke was the most important sound in the world. Slowly, across weeks and then months, she began speaking to Carol, then to Daniel, then to the ordinary world that had been waiting patiently at the edges of her silence. Her voice was soft and careful, the voice of someone who had learned that words were not to be wasted, but it was fully and completely hers. When the nightmares came, Shadow was already awake, already beside her, his weight solid and warm against the dark. He had once walked through minefields at Aaron Calloway's side. Now he walked through his daughter's dreams, standing guard at every shadow that reached for her, faithful and steady and utterly without fear. He had protected the country once. Now he protected the last piece of Aaron Calloway left in the world. Years later, Laura helped build a small rescue program for retired military and law enforcement canines. She focused on the difficult ones, the ones who startled at sounds that reminded them of things they were trying to forget, the ones who had served faithfully and come home carrying weight no one could see. She understood those dogs in a way that required no explanation. When a frightened German shepherd arrived shaking in the back of his kennel, Laura would pull a chair beside the door and simply sit, not reaching in, not speaking immediately, just being present, patient, and completely without demand, sometimes for an hour, sometimes longer. And the dog would always eventually come forward. Because silence, she had learned, was not always emptiness. Sometimes it was grief in the only coat it had been given. Sometimes it was memory waiting for something safe enough to open toward. And sometimes, if you were still enough and patient enough, silence became the exact shape of the voice that was about to come home. Shadow lived to be 13 years old.
On his last morning, snow was falling outside the kitchen window, soft and slow, the gentle kind. Laura noticed it when she came downstairs and stood in the doorway, and something moved through her that she did not try to name because she recognized it. She had felt it once before, on a mountain road a long time ago, just before the world changed. Shadow was lying in a patch of early light on the kitchen floor. His breathing was slow and very shallow. His muzzle was almost entirely white. When he opened his eyes and found her standing in the doorway, they were the same amber they had always been, calm, steady, completely hers. She sat down on the floor beside him, not in a chair, on the floor, the way she had always sat with him when it mattered most. She put her hand against his side and felt the slow rise and fall of him, and stayed there and let herself feel every single thing without trying to make any of it smaller. Daniel came and sat on the other side of Shadow. He placed his large hand gently on Shadow's back and left it there. Carol stood in the doorway with her hand on the frame. The three of them were quiet together in the early morning light, while the snow came down outside, soft and forgiving, the same snow that had been falling the night everything changed, and the same snow that was falling now as everything came full circle. Laura leaned down close to Shadow's ear.
"You took care of him," she whispered. "Out there, in all those places I'll never see. You walked beside him, and you brought him home. And then you found me. You gave me my voice back, and you kept every nightmare away, and you never once left me alone in the dark." Her voice broke, and she stopped and breathed, and then continued, soft and steady. "You did everything right, Shadow. Every single thing. You were so good. You were always so good." His tail moved once, one slow, gentle sweep across the kitchen floor, and then it was still. Laura pressed her face into the warm fur of his neck and held on the way she had held on when she was 6 years old and the world was still whole and her father's voice still filled every room. She held on until she was ready to let go, and then she sat up and looked at the snow outside the window and breathed. Aaron Calloway loved his country enough to serve it with everything he had. He loved his daughter enough to call her his best mission, and he loved a dog enough to kneel in a snowy driveway on a quiet evening and press his forehead against that broad and faithful head and ask, in a voice meant only for the two of them, to take care of his girls. Shadow heard him. Shadow never stopped. And a little girl who lost her voice in the wreckage of one terrible night found it again in the back hallway of a shelter, with her hand through the bars and her father's dog pressed warm against her palm. She carried that voice forward into a life that honored every person and every animal who had ever loved her enough to stay. That is not a small thing. That is everything. If this story reached something inside you tonight, if it brought someone to mind, a father, a soldier, a faithful dog, a child who needed more time, please take a moment and subscribe to Exists, because people like you believe that these lives deserve to be remembered, that faithful service deserves to be honored, that the ones who stood watch in the dark deserve to have their stories told in the light. We will never stop telling them. Honor the ones who served. Hold the ones you love a little closer tonight. And never forget that somewhere out there, love is still finding its way home. We will see you in the next story. Until then, stand.